Welcome to the Client Connection, where we help attorneys and clients bridge the gap between them to help increase case success. I'm your host, Edith Nazarian. I am a criminal and immigration attorney based in Los Angeles. Today, we will be talking about communication and how attorneys and clients can help improve the communication between them. To help me do this, I have a very special guest, Dimitrios Loukakis, who is a communication specialist. Hi, Dimitrios. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm so excited to have you here. So, a little bit about Dimitrios. He is a Los Angeles-based voice and communication specialist with a mission to coach others to become more confident and competent communicators. He has taught actors and journalists at universities throughout the UK and the US, has coached numerous public speakers and presenters. Dimitrios trains individuals to speak in inspiring and strategic ways while offering practical communication tools that can be applied immediately. He is a lead trainer for the Moxie Institute, and he has an excellent track record of working alongside companies like Microsoft, TDK, and others to amplify their message through public speaking and storytelling. So, Dimitrios, can I call you Dimitri? Is that fine? Or what do you prefer?
Yes. Most people who know me, they would call me Dimitri. I prefer the word Dimitri. You will find me Dimitrios online. Anything that's written down, including my passport, it's a very official name, version of my name. I'm Greek. It's a Greek name, so that's where this weird variations are coming from.
Okay, wonderful. So, Dimitri, now when we're talking about communication and you're a communication specialist, I mean, that's a pretty big topic. So, can you please maybe define what we'll be talking about, what, you enjoy talking about?
Yeah, so my specialism is specifically nonverbal communication. So my studies are in voice. So when we talk about tone, when we talk about how we're coming across vocally, this is pretty much part of my studies. And from that, I also expanded to things like body language. So different elements of what we call non-verbal communication.
Okay, I love that because I feel like we were talking about this a little before, it's not so much what you say, but how you say it, right?
Exactly. It's about how we say what we say. So if you think of our communication very broadly categorized in these two things, what being the content, what may be included in an email, if you like. The words themselves that we use is the what. I specialize in the how. So the tone of voice, the body language. And if you think in that written world, think of it as bold or italics, for example, the spacing in your email. The words would remain the same, but you have all these tools to direct the attention of the reader, or in my case, listener. And these are the tools that I'm dealing with. And these are the tools that I specialize in the nonverbal realm, if you like. So, yeah.
Got it. Okay, that sounds great. I mean, in having this conversation, I think the why is really important. And this is why I really wanted us to talk today about why is communication important and what does good communication look like? And for me, the why is, if we have good communication, it is more likely that we'll have a good relationship. And I feel like that's so important for attorneys and clients to be able to communicate well with each other, because I believe that will help their relationship and in turn help the chances of their case doing well in general, right? So that's kind of my take on it. And I want to hear from you, your thoughts, but also, in your opinion, what does good communication look like?
So I like this. I like the concept of good communication means good relationships, and it is true, and it is something that also is very good at showing the value of good communication. I would say I will zoom in, if I may, a little bit more into what we mean. What does good communication look like? Um, by saying that there's a few different levels of communication, and there is like a fundamental level of good communication, which means you're not being misunderstood in very simple terms. So, what comes out of your mouth is what the other person actually hears. And we usually make this assumption that it would be the same, but it's very often not the same. So let's say a world where misunderstandings don't happen is a world where communication is working very well. Okay, so that's on the first level, if you like, of good communication. The second thing is that as you're speaking, I may be able to understand you without a misunderstanding, but it is not, you may not communicate, not you, just anyone, I suppose, may not communicate in a what we call a brain friendly way. Okay, communication is a practice that examines exchange of information in a very basic fundamental level. So if you're saying something, if you're saying uh, red and green, and I can understand red and green, but if it takes me a lot of effort, if it takes my brain a lot of energy to follow what it is you're saying, then I'm unlikely to stay engaged. So this is when people start drifting off. So sometimes it can be that you throw a lot of technical language, which is, I suppose, more related to content than anything, or sometimes you have a voice that is very monotone. So is there a misunderstanding? No, I'm able to understand what it is you're saying, but it becomes very difficult for me to pay attention to it because you don't communicate in a very brain-friendly way. Third level is where I think you would include your definition of relationships, which has to do with how we're coming across, branding, if you like. So you may be able to communicate something, you're getting the message across. It is done in an easy and brain-friendly way, yes, but does it represent you in the best way possible? Are you coming across as someone who is listening well, perhaps, who is listening to your client very well? Are you coming across as someone that your client feels like you understand their case beyond the legal terms, which may be floating in your head, but it's definitely not floating in your client's head? Do they feel like you have a good relationship with them? And that's I suppose the third level beyond misunderstanding. Brain friendly communication is that kind of deeper level of connection that can be facilitated with good communication.
Got it. So you said a lot of interesting things just now, and thank you for breaking that down. I think it's very useful. The second part, the second level that you were talking about, the first thing that came into my mind was legalese, right? So we have a client, they come in, and we're talking to them. And there are so many legal terms, so many legal terms. And you are tasked as an attorney, right? We're trained in this. We understand, what extreme hardship is, for example, or exceptional and extremely unusual hardship, the difference, or parole, or various things, right? In our areas of practice. But when we have a client come in and, we're so used to saying these terms, but now we have to say it to a client who may have never heard of that term in their life, right? And what would you say would be the best practice to do in those types of cases when we have these quote unquote legalese terms that we need to discuss with the client, which are, really necessary to their case?
So I will say two things. The first thing is there's two filters. The first filter would be, how much do they need to know? So do they need to know this term? Do they need to know what it means? Because not all terms should be perfectly understood by the client. The second thing is, once you have, if there is a term that the client needs to understand, you need to, for me, you need to explain to the client what each term means in plain and simple language. Now, this is sometimes the issue is not usually the attorney's inability to explain it. Usually it's the attorneys are so used to using this language, they don't even know which words are not being understood. So generally we have this thing of sometimes when there is a lack of communication, there is an issue. Sometimes the client themselves are too embarrassed to ask. So they'll let you continue and they go, mm-hmm. They'll nod and smile. What I tend to call in my profession, I tend to call this performative listening. They tend to nod and smile. Very good, great, because they're embarrassed to ask. For me, this is the important part where the more interaction you have, the quicker you'll start spotting these cases. If you find yourself going into long monologues about what is happening, what is the strategy, what are the challenges, what is the paperwork that is required, what is the chances of us going this way versus that way, whatever, all of that, and you realize the client has not said anything, ask them a few open-ended questions, because that will tell you more about who they are, where they come, what are they thinking in terms of this. And this way, it will also feel to them that it's less of you providing a service and them being on the passive end, but it will help them feel that it's also more of a collaborative process, that they're an active member in that relationship. And that, as you mentioned earlier about relationships, that will also give them more ownership of what is happening and also empower them to ask more questions about the terms they don't actually understand.
So I really, really like that strategy and that tip that you just said, because, for me, when I have a meeting, I'll always tell the client, or if I have a consultation, it's my first time meeting them, I tell them, if there's anything you don't understand, please tell me, right? In a way, that's telling the client, look, that's in a way putting it on the client to let you know what they're thinking. But I really like what you just explained in, one, let's break things down to their fundamentals, right? Because we have to be conscious of who our audience is, and our audience typically, not always, sometimes they are attorneys or client, there can be attorney clients, but when they're not attorneys and they're not used to these types of terms, you know, you have to be cognizant of that, aware of that, so that you can better get your point across and make sure that they understand. And with the asking open-ended questions to make sure they're following along, right? And incorporating their feedback into the conversation. That's a great way of, it's a great litmus test, I feel, to kind of feel, okay, do they understand? Do they understand what's going on? And are they asking questions? I think that's really important. If, maybe they don't understand, but they just don't feel like they should mention something as you're talking. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and also it depends on the questions you ask them as well. I just need to be very clear that I don't want people to ask, can you just tell me what you understand from this? Because of course the client will feel like they're being tested, right? But if you ask them their opinion about what they think of this, and you can say, I can also have my professional opinion, but I'd like to know, what do you think of this?
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the most effective ways to get someone to feel validated as well, to feel like their opinion matters, because
Yeah.
it does, like what the client feels and thinks is actually important. You want both of you need to be on board in that collaborative process. So it is important what they think and feel, and perhaps they could have formed an opinion that is based on misunderstanding, and if you don't ask them this, you will never find out.
Right.
So it's just bringing a lot more transparency to that whole process, and it achieves a very good buy-in from the client, which is such a powerful tool in that relationship. So
Absolutely. I mean, I think when it comes to relationships, emotions are so key and critical. So if the client feels like you are listening to them, their opinion matters. It just helps the relationship between you so much more. So I really like that tip. Um, how you were talking about nonverbal communication at the beginning, and I just would love to hear from you some examples of either good, well, we'll get into the bad, but some good examples of nonverbal communication that you think could really improve communication.
Good examples of nonverbal communication.
Mm-hmm.
What are we looking for in other terms,
So,
right?
so let's say I have a client. I'm in a meeting, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And um, they're sitting across from me.
Hmm.
Let's say we're sitting across from each other, and I introduce myself, and we start getting into their questions or the case or questions that they have. So let's say I'm speaking.
Hmm.
Let's say I'm speaking. What sort of nonverbal communication tools can I use that will help the client know that, emotionally, right? We were talking about emotion, that I care about what they're saying, or I care about their case, or just things to let them know that this is a good relationship. This will be a good relationship.
Okay. I will give you one tool. I think it's probably the most important tool. And there is a lot of research behind this. Actually, the first research there was a study in 92 in North Italy, actually. And it was when they studied how empathy works, basically.
Okay. Okay.
The brain function of empathy, and it comes from something people call it neural resonance. Sometimes it has a few different names, but it is essentially the idea that when we feel connected, similar neurons fire up in our brains, otherwise known sometimes as mirror neurons, or the
Mm-hmm.
mirror neurons that some people call them empathy neurons. And the idea is that experiment in, I think it was 92, early 90s, but I think it was 92 in Italy, basically proved that if you, when it was done with monkeys, actually, when you see someone do something, if you start feeling and connecting with them, similar neurons are firing up in your brain, even though you're not actually going through that activity yourself. And this was the beginning of an explosion in neuroscience. And it basically means that in practice, when people feel connected, and you can see this in public spaces like restaurants, for example, or in parks, when people feel connected, they start assuming similar body positions. So you see them cross their legs the same way, or they kind of like start touching their face the same way, they're leaning onto the same side. And that also works vocally as well. When you see someone like, oh, I'm so excited about it, and you hear somebody else, oh, yeah, so exciting, right? Like you have that same kind of vocal energy or vocal
Uh-huh.
gesture, sometimes we call it. And this is in a way how we feel connected to each other. So, what does that mean in practice for you as somebody's walking in? And this happens very often, especially in cases of client and attorney relationships. A lot of the people that walk through your doors are going through a lot. Let's just say that this is not the happiest moment for them. Okay. They're in trouble one way or another. Okay. They're there. It's almost a bit like being in a hospital sometimes. Like nobody chose to be there. Nobody woke up and said, you know what would be great is to have a legal battle of sorts. Like they're kind of there because they kind of have to, or at least I'm assuming most of the cases. And a big mistake that I see a lot of time, people going, hey, hello, how's, they're trying to cheer them up,
Okay. Uh-huh.
which may start creating a disconnect. In a way, very different brains are firing up in your
Mm-hmm.
very different neurons are firing up in your brain comparing to theirs, and they see that disconnect and they go, they're not really listening, they don't
Mm-hmm.
really understand my case. So I would say, without, of course, going to the extreme of that and almost like mimicking them, we want to avoid that at all times. I just want to clarify. But some sort of like see where their position is in their body, see where they are vocally, and see if you can adopt, let's say, a similar energy. And this will can go a long way in them setting up the stage, or creating the ideal circumstances for some connection to happen.
So I love that, because there's so much of what you said that I resonate with, in the work that I do. Definitely. We have clients who are going through so much. Criminal and immigration, I mean, it's almost within the anatomy of the practice areas. So, what you said about empathy and mirroring, and I really think it's all about thinking about the other person, right? Putting yourself in that person's shoes when they walk in. What are they going through? What are they going through, and why are they there in your office? Why are they there? They need, your help. And to keep that in mind and think about their situation, you know, it helps you, I think, with what you were saying, get into that empathetic zone and being able to mirror authentically, right? Because you are thinking about them and you're genuinely caring about their situation. Um, and by doing that, it kind of fosters naturally this good communication. Would you agree?
Yes, I agree. I would say you hit the nail on the head when you said, when you're talking about essentially the most important rule, if one was to take away something, is understanding communication works best when we try to understand the other as deeply as possible. And that happens maybe before they even walk through the door. To try to understand what is happening with that person. What is it likely their emotional state to be? And then the more information you receive, the more you have a better understanding of who they are, the more accurate you can be, and the better you can connect with them. So it's all about understanding the other. And you will find this in probably more things that we may or may not talk about later. But you've already found things in when we talked earlier about jargon, legal jargon, perhaps. If I truly make an effort to understand you, then I may start filtering and start thinking about what type of language I'm using. If I try and genuinely understand you, then the connection will happen much, much earlier from the moment you
Mhm.
walked in through the door. So it's all about understanding the other, being curious, being intrigued about the other, being less self-centered, less about, oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to say? And more about what's happening over there with that person. You can't go wrong if you do that.
I love that. And I completely agree. And I think it goes into the topic of being really intentional. As we enter a meeting, and I love that you said even before a meeting, right? I mean, we have to be thinking about these things even before we see a client, right? Um, what the issue is, what are they going through? We typically will know what is happening to a client before they enter into the meeting, and thinking about their situation, being very intentional about the goal of the meeting and what they want to get out of it, what you want to get out of it, as well as their attorney. It's I think so critical. And by being intentional and thinking about these nonverbal um, communications between each other, that I think will just help facilitate just a more effective and efficient uh, case.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. We talked a lot about really, what is communication? How can we improve communication? What are some tips for that? I want to know now. what do you think hinders communication? What can really get in the way of a relationship?
Um, what can get in the way? In one word, the first thing I would mention is sometimes and it's personal, this for people, our inability to change or our non-willingness to change. So there is that idea of authenticity, which is a beautiful concept, but it can be very often misinterpreted. It's very often misinterpreted because you say authenticity, and I can take that and call it complacency. Authenticity. I am who I am. I don't need to change for anyone. I don't need to change for people. I don't need to do anything. How are you going to grow without change? How are you going to learn? How are you going to move forward? It can be very sometimes tendencies to be more complacent, to be more sometimes, dare we say, lazy sometimes, and say, like, start giving excuses for staying where we are because we like the comfort of our present moment and we are not very keen on the discomfort of change. We may find the narratives that suit us. And sometimes the concept of authenticity, I find, can have that trap within that.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe in authenticity in communication, and that's perhaps for another conversation. But I think it's more embracing the idea of change, embracing the idea of that you can be not just different, but more. You can achieve better this and better that, and you can be this person who achieves that. And that comes from, as you mentioned earlier, I really like the word that you mentioned, intention. That I intend to become someone who is deeply connected with their clients. I intend to have return clients because they come back to me because we have built that relationship, or they can be active referrals out there in the industry for me because
Right. Yeah.
they sing my praises, and for that, with first of all the mindset of growing and moving forward, and not having that is, I would say, probably the number one reason that hinders
Mm-hmm.
people from growth. That's the first thing. And I will also mention one more thing. I won't mention too many because we don't have enough time, but I will mention one thing, and that is assumptions. People make a lot of assumptions, and in some way we can't we do make some basic assumptions, perhaps code of conduct, that someone's going to come and arrive and be polite and all of that stuff. But a lot of the times we move ahead by making a little bit too many assumptions. We assume that someone is in a certain place, and we assume what they might be feeling. And first of all, yes, this may be the case. Oh, I assume they might be quite distressed. And they come, they're actually pretty happy. They're having a great day. Great, pivot fast, right? So these assumptions, I say, approach your interactions with a healthy amount of uncertainty. Ask questions. And how does that feel for you? And what is happening there? The more information you have, the less assumptions you need to make, which means then your behaviors are more likely to be behaviors that will help you connect with your clients. So assumptions, too many assumptions, as we're speaking, even as we're speaking, I see people even in parties or social events or networking out there, people saying things about themselves that they assume the other person wants to hear.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Not necessarily the case. That's not the question they asked you. So
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that they're interested in what you have to say about this. So be very careful about what you say and how you say it, not making assumptions about what the other person may want to hear or how they may want to hear it as well.
Right. I love how that connects with what we were talking about at the beginning. And you touched on this too, even how, if maybe a client is not saying something, right?
Mhm.
You can't just assume they understand everything that you're saying, right?
Mhm.
So, and going into the authenticity slash change
Yeah.
topic that you mentioned, I think that's a really interesting concept because I mean, when I think of somebody being very stubborn and saying, I'm not going to change my ways, I mean, I'm being authentic. What do you think is where's the line drawn? Do you think when someone is really being authentic and versus, they're just being really stubborn?
The line in what way? What do you mean? What is the line?
So where do you think the line should be drawn? Where do you think authenticity should be honored?
Mm-hmm.
And where do you think it's actually um, no more of a hindrance in this situation when it comes to communicating?
So I prefer to not make a judgment on who the person is and what is the right amount. The right amount is a personal choice, is defined by the person. A person may be more or less secure within themselves. They may be more able to embrace change than somebody else. And yes, there is a right amount. We're not looking for people who are completely spineless. We're not looking for people who are kind of like adapt to a situation so much,
Right.
depending on who they're in front of. You don't even know who this person is. Where are their morals, their sense of integrity, the sense of what is it, their identity, what is it that makes them? So absolutely, there is that side that says, hey, you are a person, you have your own principles, you have your own integrity, you are this person, and it's okay to stick to that um, as a vision of who you are. And on the other side, there is a side that says, like, yes, you have all these things, and you can improve these things, and you can change.
Mm-hmm.
To anyone that resists this change, I tend to say that you do change more than you think. So you're already changing. The way you will speak to a 5-year-old, the way you speak to your partner, the way you speak to your client, the way that you'll speak to someone you just met at a party, these are all different ways, and you use different voices and different words to communicate with all these people. So you're already doing that. And what we're doing what I do with my clients in training is we're extending that to the different types of client, to the different professional circumstances that you find yourself in, and we become more conscious of that process. So I would say, yes, there are the two extremes. And if we start changing too much, the other person may go into panic. And we don't want that, because that's not a place where you can learn. I don't believe in going out of your comfort zone, that you're so far out of your comfort zone, you start
Yeah.
losing it, right? And nobody really talks about that. There is that danger, right? And at the same time, we don't want that to have such a narrow field within your definition of who you are and what you do, that you're resisting any kind of change, which is where growth lies. So we need to find a good balance, and through discussion find out how ready the other person is to embrace how much change.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just say there's not a universal right amount of change that is true for everyone. It depends on the person and even the time of their lives. Some people are just really tired. And I have turned down customers who give me a vision of where they want to be and what they want to do, but they've just gone through a divorce or something. It's just not ready for it. And that's
Yeah.
okay. That's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, no, I think in speaking about the authenticity and, and the change concept, it makes me think of times when I really had to stand my ground with a client, right? Or a potential client
Mm-hmm.
that, we may not see eye to eye, right? So in those cases, integrity tells me that I need to conduct my practice in a certain way, right? And my job is also to communicate with this client that I don't see eye to eye with necessarily, right? In a professional way of why, what they're saying, it just won't work, right? I mean, I remember I had somebody come in for a consultation with me, and he was telling me how to do the case. He had seen so many different attorneys that he thought he knew exactly the way he had to do the case, how the case needed to be done. He just needed somebody to do it. And I looked at him and I said, I'm sorry, but I disagree. This is how I see it. And if you don't see it that way, we can't work together. Right. And so it's very important. I think authenticity is important And what you said is, balancing this, finding the right in between to say, okay, this is my truth. This is ethically, professionally what I stand behind. And if a client doesn't maybe see eye to eye with you, it's your job to communicate that, but in a way that doesn't necessarily, destroy a relationship. You never want to destroy a relationship, right? And still taking the tools that you were also discussing about being empathetic, still thinking about their situation, right? Even
Mhm.
when you're having a disagreement with them,
Mhm.
potentially, is thinking about where are they coming from, right?
Mhm.
But, telling your truth, right? And standing behind that, even if you don't necessarily see each other from the same perspective.
Exactly. And I think in that case, this is a very interesting example that you bring up of like how to decide to not work with someone without ruining that relationship. And that can feel like a minefield, and sometimes it is. I think has to do with, I would say, first of all, your nonverbal communication should never come across as either disappointed or aggressive or anything like that. It should be, you should continue communicating with that same enthusiasm, even if you feel like this is unlikely to move forward, right? To kind of, with that same enthusiasm, you go, oh, you're not going to be a client, are you? You might be thinking that, but you kind of need a sense of like, hey, do I want this person to still have a good relationship with this person? And if you do, I would say nonverbal should definitely reflect that. So open body language. If you stop smiling all of a sudden, people will read that. People will pick that up very quickly. So keep that same nonverbal, open, polite, and positive. And the second thing is that always offer options. So the client does not feel that they're out of control, that you controlling the narrative. So we have a few options here. You have one option, which is if you want this way and you know exactly what to do, you can have and represent yourself. And this is what it entails. Option two is to find an attorney who will either fully agree with your strategy or is very willing to bypass their own strategy and offer you the flexibility that you might need right now. And there is the option three, which is to work together and go this way, etc., etc. And then make sure, because people will not necessarily, again, the assumption that people will hear what you've just said, is to reaffirm in that moment that in all these cases, I want to make sure that to say that I absolutely really enjoyed working with you in so far. Um, I am I want what is best for you. And I think at the end, you are the person who knows what's best for you better than me. So
Right.
out of these three choices, I don't want to make that choice for you. I think the choice should be yours. And I will respect that choice. Because at the end of the day, if you believe one thing is better and I'm trying to shove another thing down your throat, that's not going to work. I want you to be happy with the choice that you make. And then, and also that this will not affect the our relationship as we've built it, because I feel like we have a good relationship, we have a good connection. I think we communicate very well, and that regardless of whether we'll continue working together, I would not want that to change.
Dimitri, I 100% agree with that. I love how you just said that.
And this way, it's all on them. There's no rivalry. There's no like, oh, the hard feelings. But if you just say, ooh, you know what, I think this may not work that well. It is very
Yeah.
likely for the other person to take it personally. Put it on them. It's their choice. All you're offering is clarity and transparency. And then we combine with that all good intention for the well-being of the person you have in front of them. It could
Yeah.
be that they're a nice person and maybe they can't see beyond what their limited understanding is. And that's the same for all of us. We all function from a largely place of ignorance for most things in the world. Like there's so much in the world I don't know about most things in the world, right? So it's normal for people to kind of just get the wrong end of what is required and not knowing, and with some a little bit unjustified, unsupported conviction, just go in there guns blazing and kind of say, I think this should be it. And that's okay. Perhaps this is an insecurity behind it and lack of flexibility. That's on them. Good intentions, study, listen, try to understand the other person, and then communicate in a clear way. And I think this will go well.
Yeah, no, I love that. Completely agree. And I feel like a lot of what you're saying just sounds like teamwork to me. We're
Mhm.
both attorneys, clients. We're working together on the same thing. And we want the same and good end result, right? And we really need to listen to each other and work with each other to do what's best for both of us, and separately but also together, right?
Yeah.
So I think this was amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dimitri. This was really lovely. Um, we, I think, covered everything that we wanted to, and then some.
And then some. Exactly.
Uh, so I wanted to ask you though, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do so?
Okay. Great question. Well, I would say first go to my website.
Mm-hmm.
So that's Dimitrios Loukakis, how you see the name, just one word, no dashes, periods, or anything. DimitriosLoukakis.com that will take you straight to my website. You can communicate, you can get in touch through that. Or just my last name, Loukakis at gmail.com would be the other way. You can email me through there as well. And on my website, I have more information about how I work with each client and what I do there. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Dimitrios Loukakis. You will find me there. Any of these ways are all good ways.
Perfect. Dimitri,
Thank
this
you.
was such a pleasure.
And me too. Thank
Um,
you.
and to everyone listening, if you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to follow and subscribe. And if you have any suggestions for future topics or future speakers that you'd like to hear from, please let me know at podcast@enlawoffices.com. Thank you for listening and watching. And till next time.